The night the voices first drifted through the Missouri pines, every lantern in the tiny settlement of Dry Creek flickered at once, as though the forest itself had inhaled. Folks said it sounded like two children calling from different directions, their tones merging into a single trembling cry. Others insisted it was something older, something that learned long ago how to mimic the human voice. But those who had lived longest near the ridge knew better. They whispered that the Granger twins were singing again, just as they had done in childhood, long before their strange disappearance. Two sisters, bound not only by flesh but by a fate the Ozarks would forever refuse to speak of openly. Born under a storm so violent it split trees like matchsticks, the sisters entered the world conjoined at the shoulder, their two heads turning toward the same terrified doctor. Their father, Elijah, never forgave the world for the way it looked at them, with fear, fascination, and something close to disgust. So he took them into the woods, deeper each year, until no one saw the girls except through rumor. By the time they reached womanhood, no one in Dry Creek even knew the sound of their voices anymore, only that they were said to echo through the trees long after sunset. Strange shadows. Stranger rituals. And a father whose devotion took on a shape the town dared not name. When the traveling minister fled from Elijah's homestead, rambling about, a household sealed by sin, and daughters who called their father husband, people crossed themselves and locked their doors. No one went to investigate for nearly a decade. Not until the disappearances began. A trapper vanished. A hunter's bloodied hat was found in the creek. Then came the singing again, soft at first, then rising in a trembling harmony that made even the bravest men feel their bones tighten. By the time the sheriff finally pushed through the forest to Elijah's cabin, the fire was still warm, and 3 sets of footprints led into the pines, but none returned. And on nights when the wind died and the moon was thin, those who dared listen swore they could still hear the voices, 2 heads, 1 body, bound forever to the men who raised them, calling from a place where the living should not follow. The story of the Granger twins begins long before their names were ever whispered in fear, back when the Missouri Ozarks were still more wilderness than map, and every clearing had a secret. In the spring of 1906, the forest was swollen with rain, and thunder rolled so violently across the hillsides that it rattled loose stones from the ridge. Folks in Dry Creek later claimed the storm was the worst they'd ever seen, the kind that seemed to twist the sky into knots. That was the night the midwife, old Clara Wixon, was roused from her cot by frantic knocking. Elijah Granger stood on her porch drenched to the bone, shouting that his wife's time had come and she was bleeding too heavily to make the journey alone. Clara, who had helped deliver half the town, strapped on her boots and followed him into the dark, never knowing the shape of the tale she was about to step into. The Granger homestead lay miles off the main road, reachable only by a muddy path that turned to a river under heavy rain. Scratch marks from fallen branches decorated the roof, and the windows shook with each blast of wind. Inside, the air felt unnaturally still. When Clara approached the bedside, she saw Mrs. Granger pale as wax, trembling not only from pain but from a dread she couldn't speak. The storm roared so loudly it swallowed her screams, but Clara pressed on, guiding the birth with hands that had steadied countless mothers. Only this time, something was different. The child did not come with the expected rhythm. The pushing stretched longer, and the shadows on the walls seemed to flicker as though they too anticipated something they could not name. When the infant finally emerged, Clara froze, not from fear, but from a shock that rooted her feet to the floorboards. 2 heads, 2 faces, 2 sets of eyes opening at once, but one body beneath them, trembling and gasping for its first breaths. The sisters cried in overlapping tones, their wails bending into a single quivering echo that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Clara had seen deformities before, births touched by misfortune or illness, but never anything like this. Elijah stepped forward with a look that mixed awe with something more complicated, something darker, as if he believed the storm itself had chosen this moment to reshape his bloodline. Mrs. Granger, already weakening beyond recovery, whispered only once to see her daughters, touching their tiny hands before her strength faded for the final time. And as the lantern light dimmed and the rain beat harder against the roof, Elijah wrapped the newborns with a strange, fervent reverence, as though the world outside could not be trusted to witness them. Elijah Granger's decision to raise the twins in isolation was not something he announced or explained, it happened slowly, almost invisibly, like moss creeping over a forgotten stone. After his wife's burial on the hill behind the cabin, he began refusing help from the town, shutting his doors to neighbors who brought food or blankets, turning away the doctor who offered to examine the children. At first, folks assumed it was grief driving him deeper into himself. Losing a wife in childbirth could break the gentlest of men, and Elijah had never been a man built for crowds. But as seasons passed, his solitude hardened into something more deliberate, something that made even the friendliest people keep their distance. The twins, Lyra and May, grew quickly, their two heads turning with uncanny coordination, their small hands always clasping something, each other's fingers, the hem of Elijah's shirt, a corner of the quilt. They rarely cried, but when they did, the sound carried far beyond the homestead, drifting into the trees like a call from somewhere not quite human. Elijah took this as a sign that they were meant for quiet places, and he made every effort to ensure they never encountered anything else. When Clara Wixon hiked up the ridge one afternoon to check on them, she found the gate locked and Elijah standing on the porch with a shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. He thanked her for her kindness but told her the girls didn't need interference from people who couldn't understand them. She left unsettled, certain she had seen the shadow of one twin looking out from behind the curtain. Years slipped by, and the girls became figures of legend. Children dared each other to walk near the Granger property at dusk, whispering that if you listened closely, you could hear two voices humming from within the walls, harmonizing in a way that made the hair on your arms rise. Elijah kept them inside most days, teaching them himself, their world limited to the cabin, the yard, and the forest's edge. On rare occasions when someone spotted them by the creek, the sight was so startling that it etched itself into memory. Two young girls with intertwined movements, their dresses sewn into a single garment, their steps short and cautious as Elijah hovered behind them like a shadow. The isolation shaped them as much as their birth had. They grew up without friends, without laughter shared with anyone their age, without the ordinary rhythm of small-town life. Elijah insisted the world outside was cruel, unprepared to accept them, hungry for spectacle. And in a place like the Missouri Ozarks, where fear traveled faster than truth, his warnings were easy to believe. The fewer people saw the twins, the more the stories grew, until the Granger cabin became a place no one visited willingly, a place where silence felt too heavy and every unanswered question only fed the next rumor. The rumors might never have taken solid shape if not for the traveling minister who wandered into Dry Creek during the autumn of 1915, a thin man with a cracked Bible and the kind of eyes that looked as though they'd seen too much road and too many sins. He arrived on a Sunday morning, dust-coating his boots, asking if there were any troubled souls in need of prayer. Folks pointed him toward the Granger property almost eagerly, hoping a holy man might succeed where they had failed. The minister hesitated at first. He had heard whispers along the way, strange births, strange voices, and a family that kept to itself in a manner that felt unnatural even for backwoods living. But duty pulled him up the ridge, and he set out with a confidence that dwindled the closer he came to Elijah's path. The woods around the cabin were so quiet they felt staged, as though every creature had stepped aside to watch what might unfold. The minister later described feeling watched before he even reached the porch, but he pressed on, calling out Elijah's name. When the door finally opened, Elijah stood over him silently, his expression polite yet guarded, his daughters visible only as a movement in the dimness behind him. The minister asked to speak with the girls, saying he wished to offer them blessings, to guide them towards spiritual comfort. Elijah declined with such abruptness that the minister felt his spine tighten. Something in the man's tone, in the stiffness of his posture, suggested he was protecting them not from harm but from being seen. Still, the minister was persistent. He returned the next morning, standing at the gate and praying aloud, hoping perhaps that the sound would draw the girls out. Instead, the curtains twitched once, and then the door slammed shut. He slept uneasily that night in the home of a farmer down the road, waking to what he claimed were two voices whispering just outside the window, their tone neither threatening nor friendly, simply aware of him. When he left the Ozarks 3 days later, he did so with trembling hands. Before he crossed the county line, he stopped at the general store and told whoever would listen that something was profoundly wrong up at the Granger cabin. He spoke of Elijah's possessiveness, of the girls' eerie synchronization, of a bond that felt twisted by secrecy, and of an atmosphere so stifling he believed the family was locked in a union the Lord did not sanction. Word spread faster than wildfire on a dry ridge. People repeated his claims with each retelling stretching the story further, turning concern into suspicion and suspicion into scandal. In a town where isolation was already considered strange, the minister's warnings gave shape to the fears people had carried silently for years, igniting a storm of gossip that would cling to the Granger name long after the minister vanished down the road. Strange happenings began stirring near the Granger property long before anyone connected them to the whispers surrounding Elijah and his daughters. At first, they were small, almost forgettable incidents, a hunter losing his way despite knowing the woods better than his own kitchen, a traveler waking in the middle of the night certain he had heard someone breathing just outside his tent, dogs that refused to approach the ridge even when coaxed with fresh meat. People brushed these things off as the quirks of the Ozarks, a place where fog could swallow a manhole and the wind liked to imitate voices. But eventually, the disappearances began, and the town's uneasy glances shifted directly toward the silent cabin hidden beneath the pines. The first disappearance was a young farmhand named Caleb Turner, a boy known for his bravery and curiosity in equal measure. He had volunteered, some said dared, to deliver a parcel of supplies to Elijah after the general store complained he hadn't come down from the ridge in nearly 2 months. Caleb set off in the morning with an easy grin and a whistle on his lips. By noon, the sky had clouded over, and by evening, the boy's horse wandered back into town riderless, its saddle twisted as though someone had yanked at the reins. People assumed Caleb had fallen or injured himself and went looking for him at dawn. They found no trace. Not a scrap of cloth, not a trail of disturbed leaves, not even a footprint leading to or from the cabin. The woods felt scrubbed clean, as if something had smoothed over the land while the search party slept. More incidents followed. A trapper who worked the northern edge of the Granger land claimed he heard 2 girls laughing just beyond the tree line, though he never saw anyone. He described the laughter as layered, one voice slightly higher than the other, as if they were sharing a joke he wasn't meant to understand. Days later, he vanished too, leaving behind only his traps arranged in a perfect circle, something no animal would have done. The sight of that circle remained etched in the minds of those who discovered it, a silent symbol of a pattern forming beneath the surface. Others told of hearing strange cries echoing through the woods on moonless nights. Not human, not animal, but something caught between. Some said the calls sounded like warnings, others swore they were invitations. The sheriff dismissed these accounts at first, chalking them up to fear and superstition, until he heard the sound himself one night while riding home. The cry rose from the direction of the Granger Ridge, 2 tones merging into one unsettling harmony that made his horse rear and bolt. By the time the 4th disappearance shook the community, people no longer whispered their suspicions, they spoke them plainly. Something was happening in those woods, something tied to the Granger family. But whether it was danger, punishment, or something far stranger, no one dared to uncover. As the years passed and sightings of the Granger twins became rarer, a strange new pattern began unsettling the people who lived near the ridge. It started with sound, soft at first, almost delicate, drifting through the pines like a thread of wind. Those who lived closest to the forest reported hearing singing just after midnight, always from the direction of Elijah's cabin. At first, folks assumed it was nothing more than the creaking of branches or the murmuring of distant water. But those who listened closely swore they heard 2 distinct voices, rising and falling together in a harmony too precise, too practiced, to belong to anything natural. The voices were said to weave around each other, one slightly lower, one hauntingly higher, forming melodies that sent a shiver creeping up the spine of anyone awake to hear them. The songs rarely carried words. Most of the time, they were long drawn-out hums or slow, wavering notes that echoed across the hillsides. The unsettling part was not the sound itself, but the way it felt purposeful, as though the twins were calling out to someone or something, hidden in the trees. The melodies would start suddenly, linger for several minutes, then stop so abruptly that the silence afterward felt heavier than the song. People began timing the occurrences, noticing they happened only on nights when the moon was thin or hidden entirely behind clouds. Some claimed the voices were clearest on stormy nights, as if rain amplified them rather than drowning them out. Farmers who had to tend to late-night chores described the singing as impossible to ignore. They would be walking with lanterns in hand, heading toward a barn or checking on livestock, when the sound would float down from the ridge. More than one man admitted his legs turned to stone the moment he heard the voices, unable to decide whether to run or stand still. One woman said the melody was so beautiful it made her cry before she realized tears were falling. Another insisted the voices weren't beautiful at all, they were pleading. Stories piled up quickly. A trapper returning from the woods claimed he heard the twins humming a tune that changed pitch every few seconds, a sound he later described as 2 children trying to keep each other awake. A widow swore she heard the melody circling her house from different directions, even though she never saw anyone outside. What troubled the community most was the certainty people felt after hearing the singing, that the voices were not meant for public ears. They felt secretive, intimate, like a ritual repeated for years away from the world's gaze. In a place like the Ozarks, where superstition grows as thick as the underbrush, it didn't take long for the nighttime harmonies to become more than eerie music. they became omens. Some said the twins were warning the town. Others claimed they were summoning the spirits of the missing. And a few whispered the most unsettling belief of all, that the girls were no longer merely singing to the night but to someone standing in the dark beside them, someone whose silence filled the pauses between their notes. By the time the sheriff finally decided to ride up the ridge with a small posse, the Granger homestead had grown into a legend people preferred not to test. But with the recent disappearances and growing fear spreading through Dry Creek, he could no longer ignore the mounting pressure. Dawn was only a pale smear across the sky when the men set out, their horses uneasy the moment they left the main road. The woods felt wrong that morning, as if everything living had retreated deeper into the shadows to avoid watching what would unfold. Even the birds, usually loud and restless at first light, remained silent. The sheriff later admitted he had never experienced a quiet so thick it felt like a presence. As they approached the Granger cabin, the forest seemed to tighten around them. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangled overhead like the ribs of a giant creature. The air grew colder, carrying none of the usual scents of pine or earth. When they finally reached the clearing, the homestead stood exactly as people remembered it, a sagging porch, a chimney leaning slightly to one side, windows covered from within by old quilts. Yet there was something different too, something subtle but unmistakable. The place looked recently lived in, but no smoke rose from the chimney, and no movement stirred behind the curtains. The sheriff called out Elijah's name, his voice startlingly loud in the stillness. No answer came. After waiting several minutes, he ordered his men forward. The front door creaked open at the slightest touch, as though it had been left unlatched in a hurry. Inside, everything looked eerily ordinary, a pot still warm on the wood stove, chairs positioned around the small table, a half-finished quilt folded neatly beside a rocking chair. It was as if the family had stepped out only moments before their arrival. The sheriff touched the pot with the back of his hand and felt heat rising from it, strong enough to suggest it had been cooking only an hour earlier. What unsettled them most was the absence of any signs of struggle. No broken furniture, no footprints in the dust, no scattered belongings. Everything was tidy, almost staged. In the twins' small room, their bed linens were smoothed flat, their few toys arranged carefully along the wall. The sheriff found a hair ribbon on the floor, a simple blue strip of cloth, but it looked intentionally placed, not dropped. His men whispered among themselves that the family must have fled into the woods, but the sheriff felt a different dread forming. There were no tracks leading away from the cabin. The ground outside was soft from rain the night before, yet remained untouched, as though the earth had refused to record their passing. They searched the property for hours, circling the woods and calling the names of Elijah and the girls until their voices cracked. Nothing answered. No movement stirred. No sound returned their shouts. The sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that they had arrived minutes too late, as if the Grangers had sensed them coming long before they stepped onto the ridge. When the sun slipped behind the treetops and the shadows began to merge, the men insisted on leaving. None of them wanted to remain after dark, not with the trees leaning in and the silence deepening around them. As they rode back toward town, the sheriff looked over his shoulder one last time. The cabin stood motionless in the fading light, quiet and waiting, as if holding its breath for the next visitor brave or foolish enough to approach. The sheriff returned to the cabin the next morning with only one deputy, determined to search more thoroughly now that daylight stripped the forest of some of its quiet menace. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and smoke that shouldn't have been there. When he stepped inside, the cabin felt different than it had the previous day, not livelier, but tense, like a room that had recently held an argument. Another passage described dreams the twins shared, visions of a shadow in the woods that watched them with patience rather than malice. The writer said Elijah believed this was a sign, proof that the forest recognized their bond and would soon reveal what path must be taken. The eeriest line of all was written near the end. He says the union must be sealed before the voices come for us. The sheriff reread it several times, unsure if voices meant spirits, memories, or something the twins had conjured in their isolation. What struck him most was the desperation between the words. The writer didn't sound frightened of Elijah, but frightened of failing him, as though whatever the ceremony was meant to accomplish held consequences beyond ordinary understanding. Ashes crumbled from the journal spine as the sheriff closed it gently, the last line still glowing faintly with the imprint of someone trying to explain a secret too heavy for a young mind to define. He slipped the journal into his coat, feeling the chilling weight of it press against his ribs. Outside, the forest seemed to be listening. The sheriff first noticed the silence as he stepped outside the cabin with the journal tucked beneath his coat. When they returned to the clearing, the stillness followed them, clinging to the air like smoke. The sheriff paused at the edge of the yard and listened one last time for the familiar trill of a wren or the rustle of a rabbit hiding beneath the brush. Nothing answered. It was as if every living creature had abandoned the ridge overnight, fleeing from something the sheriff could not yet see, but could already feel tightening its grasp around the Granger land. The trapper who claimed the final sighting was not a man easily rattled. He had worked the northern Ozarks for decades, moving between ridges with the ease of someone who understood the forest's moods better than human ones. He knew which sounds belonged to foxes and which belonged to wind slipping through hollows. He knew how to read tracks even when the ground offered almost nothing. And above all, he knew when a place was not meant to be walked. That night in late autumn, as a thin fog curled between the trees and the moon hid behind a heavy veil of cloud, he felt something in the air shift. The forest was too still, too watchful, and every instinct in him whispered that he should turn back. But curiosity tugged at him more strongly than caution. For weeks he had heard the townsfolk whispering about the missing Grangers, about the sheriff's strange discoveries, and about the eerie silence that seemed to swallow the ridge. He wanted proof. What he found instead was a glimpse that would haunt him until his dying day. He had been crossing Bearcut Ridge when he saw the first silhouette. At first, he assumed it was just a tree stump shaped oddly by shadow, but as he drew closer, the shape seemed to sway gently, as if breathing. He crouched low, letting his eyes adjust. The stump shifted again. It wasn't a stump at all, it was the outline of two heads, close together, rising from a single set of shoulders. A chill raced through him, tightening every muscle in his chest. He knew the stories, of course. Everyone did. But stories were one thing. Shapes in the dark were another. He took one cautious step backward, intending to slip away unnoticed, when a second silhouette appeared beside the girl's shape, a taller one, broad-shouldered and unmistakably human. The trapper swallowed hard. Elijah Granger had been assumed dead or missing, lost to whatever calamity had claimed the twins. Yet there he stood, or something that looked like him stood, facing the same direction as the girls. None of them moved. Their stillness was not the stillness of people resting or observing. It felt staged, as though they were listening for something beyond human hearing. The trapper studied the taller figure's stance, the shape of the shoulders, the tilt of the head. It matched Elijah perfectly. But there was something off. The figure's posture seemed too rigid, its outline subtly blurred by the fog, as if the night itself were clinging to it. Just when he thought he might be imagining everything, the two-headed silhouette tilted both heads in unison, turning toward him with a synchronized motion so unnatural he nearly dropped his lantern. The taller figure turned a heartbeat later. Not quickly, not threateningly, just enough to acknowledge him. The trapper felt his breath freeze. Their eyes didn't shine like animals' eyes would in the dark. They didn't glimmer at all. They were simply there, watching from faces that should not have still existed. He ran, stumbling down the ridge, branches clawing at his clothes. He didn't look back, not once. When he reached Dry Creek, trembling and mud-splattered, he swore to the sheriff that he had seen the Granger twins alive, standing with their father on the ridge as if nothing in the world had changed. But what terrified him most was that they watched him go, not to chase, not to warn, just to watch, as though waiting for him to carry their presence back into the world they had left behind.